So looking at intelligence studies in Africa, my own personal journey into studying the field in Africa, looking at what's available, reveals a disturbing trend, in my opinion. First, my observation is that there is a dearth of literature on intelligence studies in Africa. And that is, of course, very connected to the fact that, the intelligence services in Africa are some of the most understudied organs of the security establishment. And so this is a trend that I see. I hope I'm sure maybe some of you have noticed this. Even after the so-called wind of change that ushered in the advent of democracy in the 1990s, the situation hasn't really changed much. If you survey what's available, you'll find that there are two types of literature, but there's a preponderance of one over the other. So the two types of literature that I find on intelligence in Africa is one focuses the literature written by practitioner types. That, in my opinion, seems to be the most available. And so you'll see former security officers, former intelligence officers writing about their experiences or the experiences of the organizations that they've led. And then, of course, there is the academic type. And the academic type, which is the kind of literature that is anchored in intelligence studies literature, the available literature, that is very scant. You don't find that a lot. So the question then is, why is there a dearth in this literature? From my evaluation of what's available, I think there are a number of reasons, and they're all subject to debate, but let me put them forth. First, if you look at the intelligence services that we have, or agencies that we have in Africa, they are an extension of the political systems and political systems on the continent. And for a very long time, there was a dearth of democracy on the continent, especially after independence. As an example, I'll let you know that, for instance, of the 53 countries we have in Africa back then, about 33 of them were sort of socialist in orientation. And if you look back at that era, most of the governments in Africa were sort of autocratic, one-party state and autocratic in nature. And these closed systems had a dearth in many things, in personal freedoms, freedom of expression, and that is also reflected in the dearth of study on the intelligence systems in those countries. Closed systems are not amenable usually to studying intelligence. Intelligence in general was shrouded in secrecy. And so that remained a closed area for a lot of academics to get into. I'll give you an example. In my own country, Sudan, and later, of course, South Sudan, you don't even really want to mention anything intelligence, because that will get you into trouble. And the intelligence services also of that era were mostly shrouded in secrecy, because they were really oriented towards regime protection. And so any questions about intelligence and how intelligence agents, for instance, conduct their work is tantamount to trying to question the authority of the state, and it could get one in trouble. So without much ado, then let's look at why another reason at why there is a dearth of literature on intelligence on the continent. I've just elaborated on one. The second reason that I think there is a dearth of literature is the issue of resources. To study anything, you need resources allocated for that purpose. As an example, I'll give you an example here in the United States. There's so many think tanks, and that's just because of the nature of the country, which is a superpower and very obsessed with security and what others are doing to learn, and also to prepare for to prepare themselves here for any outcomes. So there's like almost like there's an expert on every country on earth that you can find in about the 40 think tanks around here. So these think tanks are funded, of course, by private sector and government grants and all that, and there's a lot of money being allocated for young scholars to hone their craft, for advanced scholars to do more studies. So in Africa, you really don't have that. There's also the issue that the field itself is relatively new. Usually, I think intelligence studies in Africa, my survey of the universities and what is on offer, is that it's kind of shrouded or embedded within political science, or it's a subset of international relations, security studies in international relations. So there's no dedication to that. Then there's also the preponderance of lack of prior, established intelligence scholars on the continent that really talk about intelligence from an African perspective, like from an African conceptual perspective. That I think is a big problem that we have there. And when you don't have sort of like mentors, people to look up to, like the Ali Mazrouis in other fields, that really is, I think, debilitating to upcoming scholars to be interested in intelligence studies. And there's also the issue that there's resources, and then there's the issue of like we don't have a prior history of established scholars in the field. And then there's, I think, also even as we now see that there's a nascent interest in intelligence studies, in general, I tend to think that there isn't a lot of pressure on African academics to really to do research in general. What I'm saying is based on my observation, like of universities in Eastern Africa, where I've lived mostly, in South Sudan and Sudan. Promotion is not really geared, or is not tied to the number of products you can produce in academic research, for instance. And I think academics are not really under a lot of pressure to be producing something. And then, of course, there's the other issue of the resources that I've mentioned earlier. So there's no incentive to be doing research, and that is, I think, a general problem. We do have a lot of PhDs in Africa, for instance, and you look at their. I'm not saying this to diss anyone or anything, but it's an observation that I've seen. And when you look at their historical profile in research in the area that they've specialized in, there's usually very scant evidence to show. So and I think that's a function of the institutions where these people work, because there's no pressure in other parts of the world for you to progress, for instance, from the position of assistant professor to associate professor. It's due to a number of years you've spent, and also the number of publications that you have put forth, the number of grants that you brought to the university and stuff like that. So I think in Africa, we do have a problem there, where there is no, the incentive is not. The other thing that I think is predominant in exacerbating the dearth in literature is the fact that there's actually no journal that is African, that is dedicated to intelligence studies. And so what we do have is like the two major intelligence studies journals currently in the English-speaking world: the Journal of Intelligence and National Security, and the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. They're all functioning really from a very Eurocentric perspective. And not one of my pet peeves, but anyone who studied international relations, really, what you really notice is the Eurocentric nature of it. And there are so many articles that are trying to counter that. Things like the military revolution, for instance, which is like really conceptualized from a very Eurocentric perspective. So that is also reflected in intelligence studies in terms of where the journals are, and of course in terms of like the production. So when you do a keyword search of these two journals that I've mentioned, you find very the number of articles produced by Africans on African intelligence issues is really very limited. Most recently, last year, I published a piece in Intelligence and National Security. The number of emails I got from so many scholars out in the West saying, wow, this is really nice. We haven't seen a piece on Africa in a very long time. And, please keep it up and stuff. And I realized there was a problem. And when I went back to the journal to look at like who's actually African here and been publishing, and I noticed that there's just a handful of us. We've seen, someone from South Sudan, Dr. Majak, publish, and then we have Solomon Asimwe here, who also published there. Like beyond that, in the last 2 years, you don't see a lot. So those are some things that we need to be cognizant of as we delve into this field, and it behooves of us to plug the gaps that are existing. There is a discussion that follows this, which is on the sources and methods for studying intelligence in Africa. I think I will leave it here so that we can pick up from there. But what I want to say is, for all of us here, some of us who are like really just beginning in this field, is how do we plug the gap? In your PhD studies, don't just focus on, in my opinion, don't just focus on trying to get your PhD and move on. In Africa, I know, and let me speak for my own self here, in my country, just having the title PhD is kind of like a big deal, and there's a lot of prestige that comes with it. But the PhD itself, without any proof or any tangible evidence of producing knowledge to enlarge our understanding of issues, is really not that important, in my opinion. And so we do have a choice here to be different from the previous scholars that have come and gone in Africa on these issues. We have to up our game. We now have a lot of resources that are at our disposal. We have the internet. We can get information. We are connected. We're all over the world. Let's network. If you don't have resources, like you don't have access to a journal database, those of us who are outside the country, how can we help? Let's interlink. And I think the situation is much better for us right now than compared to our forefathers in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. And it behooves of us to really step up and up our game. The concepts that you learn in school, those are the concepts that you can say, like, how are they applicable to my situation in my country on intelligence? And then you play with that and produce something. So let me leave it here. We're going to delve into the next sources and methods for studying intelligence in Africa, and I hope we can open up the discussion and have more. Thank you.